Chapter 24 focuses on the United States domestically during the onset of the Cold War. So we already covered the 1950s foreign policy-wise and controversy with the Soviet Union repeatedly. We've covered that. Now we need to talk about domestic policy-wise what's going on in the United States. And you'll notice that this chapter title starts at 1953, and that's really because the transition between Harry Truman, who had taken office after the death of FDR, was re-elected in 1948, took office of his second term in 1949, technically his first term, but he had finished out the term of FDR. And so he leaves office in 1953. So in many ways, the beginning of the 50s was really an extension of the 40s, especially when you talk about like presidential administrations and such. So you'll notice this starts right around 1953 and the Eisenhower presidency. So how does Eisenhower become president? Well, Harry Truman and the Democratic message didn't seem all that necessary because people felt as though the Depression is long since over, World War II has been won, we need to go back to a sense of normalcy. And the pro-growth message that the Republican Party was offering was much more appealing, and their candidate in former World War II General Dwight Eisenhower was a very well-known figure, popular figure. And you can see on this election map where his opponent, Adlai Stevenson, only won some of the deep southern states, which was traditionally the case in this time period. The Democratic Party was very anti-civil rights, and so the Democratic Party remained widely popular in the Deep South, and the Republican Party was deeply unpopular in the Deep South because they were, in most cases, very pro-civil rights. So one of President Eisenhower's agenda items that could be considered both foreign and domestic policy, technically speaking, is the Interstate Highway System, because Eisenhower wanted the Interstate Highway Act passed and all of these highway systems built specifically for mass evacuation in the case of a national emergency. So that's where like foreign policy, the fear of the Soviets, plays into this. Luckily, none of those massive evacuations during the Cold War because of something like a nuclear strike were necessary, but it did lead to significant growth in the economy, which was the other intention. And you can see the very extensive system of interstate highways on the map to the right. With these better highways and with better vehicles, more luxurious vehicles, the growth of the suburbs and the growth of the consumer economy really took off. The baby boom generation is well underway at this point. People came home from service overseas, and while they may have once been hesitant to settle down and start a family, they very much after service in the war took the mentality of you only have one life to live and better to live it sooner rather than later. So you can see things like tabletop radios, record players, the television, which is a very new development in the 1950s. It's not a new invention necessarily, but certainly new in the sense that you would commonly see them in people's homes, particularly if they were middle-class folks who lived in a middle-class suburban neighborhood. And I also included here consumerist advertising, and I chose this advertisement of a woman opening up on Christmas morning a card that came with her new Hoover vacuum. Christmas morning, she'll be happier with a Hoover. And so not only is this showing the consumer economy, it's also showing the viewed role of women in the 1950s, and how after helping in industry to win the war, women were supposed to now leave their employment and settle down and have families and be homemakers and caretakers. And this is very much the norm in the 1950s, as foreign as that seems to us today. The Great Migration is actually a long-term phenomenon. But I mention it with the 1950s because not only were blacks moving north to escape Jim Crow laws, factory work really opened up a lot to blacks in northern industrial cities during the war because of the amount of industry that was going to be necessary to support the war effort. So the Great Migration, and it's labeled here as 1900 to 1930, I would honestly change this figure if it was me. Historically speaking, this is the years that are typically used to describe this phenomenon, but I would sooner say about 1950, which is shortly after the end of World War II, and it's really because of the growth of the industrial economy, the consumer economy, the jobs that are available in the North, and yes, those jobs also help blacks to escape Jim Crow laws in the South. And you can see a map of the Great Migration here into the industrial Midwest, here and here, into the industrial Northeast, and into the far west, out of the South. At the same time that this Great Migration is changing settlement patterns, you have a growing civil rights movement, and we've discussed this in class, very much coming out of World War II that had been fought for the four freedoms, and freedom, democracy, liberty. These are terms that are used to describe how the world should be after a war was fought to eradicate fascism in Europe. So, with many, many blacks having honorably served in World War II, this leads them to come home to particularly the Jim Crow South, but just the United States in general, and say, I'm not treated very well here. So here's a timeline of the early civil rights movement that can be linked almost directly to the end of World War II. In 1947, this is only a couple years after the end of the war, Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in Major League Baseball. Now, was he the best black baseball player in 1947? No, a large portion of baseball historians would tell you that a hitter by the name of Josh Gibson or the pitcher Satchel Paige were actually better talents than Jackie Robinson. But Satchel Paige was older and near the end of his career, or so they thought. He actually pitched until long past the average person's baseball career lifespan. They didn't know that at the time. And Josh Gibson had a history of mental health problems, alcohol abuse, and they wanted somebody who was going to be like that picture-perfect person to be the face of this breaking the color barrier. Jackie Robinson was a World War II veteran, and people that followed him when he was playing in the Negro Leagues were noticing that when approached, when confronted with racist behavior, with racist statements, he was able to keep his head and keep his cool. And they said, this is the guy that we need to break the color barrier. So that's just a little bit of the story of Jackie Robinson. But like I pointed out before, the date 1947, it's not a mistake that this is shortly after World War II, and it's not a mistake that a World War II veteran is chosen in Jackie Robinson to be the one to do this. Then in 1948, President Truman integrates the military with Executive Order 9981, another big step. Again, only another year after Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. Then, In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren, appointed by President Eisenhower to the court, not long before this, writes the majority opinion in Brown versus Board of Education. This is an epically important Supreme Court case because it is the first legal step in the civilian population in the United States. Because again, you have integration of the military, but that's only the military. What about everyday folks, everyday citizens? And so Brown versus Board of Education is that very first legal step. It's only a step, but it's a huge step in the right direction. What does it say? Well, Brown versus Board of Education said public facilities can no longer be segregated. That means schools, that means courthouses, etc. That did not, unfortunately, mean private businesses, but that would come later, and we will cover that when we get into the 1960s and the added achievements of the civil rights movement in the 60s. But Brown versus Board of Education, huge step in the right direction. This inspires a lot of civil rights activity because you're going to see more and more and more dates below. So this is accelerating, and it's almost like a snowball going downhill. It gains momentum and size as it goes. Well, so does the civil rights movement. With every success comes more support and a bigger movement. So in 1955, Rosa Parks inspires the Montgomery bus boycott. And oddly enough, people like to think of Rosa Parks as just a random woman who was tired and didn't want to give up her seat. Rosa Parks did clerical work for the NAACP. She was a member of the NAACP. It was asked who is willing to do this at an NAACP meeting, and she, among others, who raised their hands, and yes, there were others, Rosa Parks just happened to be the one that broke the big story, I guess you would say, but there were others that were brave enough, as she was, to do this. And I don't know why people always want to downplay the fact that this was a well-orchestrated and planned event, because I think it lends itself more to giving even more credit to the NAACP and its activities during the civil rights movement. To make it seem like just a random woman, I don't think that gives it near the credit it deserves. This is a well-planned event, and because she volunteered and knowingly did this, I think that makes her all the more brave, because she had to think about this. I could be beaten, maybe beaten to death. I could be wrongfully imprisoned and kept in prison wrongfully, and maybe nothing will be done of it. So these are all things long-term that she has to think about in the lead-up to the incident itself. So spontaneity, some people think that's the way the story should be told. I couldn't disagree more. I think more credit goes to Rosa Parks and to all the planning that went into this by telling the true story. Also in 1955, a very tragic story of a young boy named Emmett Till. Emmett Till is a boy from Chicago. He is the son of a single mother. She works multiple jobs to take care of him. And when school let out, she didn't want him to just hang around the streets of Chicago all summer long, so she sent him to spend his summer with some family in Mississippi. And being a northerner, Emmett Till is not completely familiar with the Jim Crow South, particularly the Deep South like Mississippi. He's playing outside of a convenience store with some friends and goofing around, and as the story's told, somebody dares him to go inside and flirt with the clerk at the counter. That can't be a confirmed fact, but that is one of the rumors of the story. And another rumor that comes out of that is after he goes in, purchases something, and comes out, rumor also adds that he maybe whistled at a white woman, the white woman behind the counter. Whatever happened, the KKK showed up at Emmett Till's house, his family's home, in Mississippi. And they demanded that Emmett be turned over. And the family at first refused, but when the Klansmen present threatened them and their children for the safety of everyone, and I'm sure this is a horrible decision that his family had a hard time living with after the fact, he is indeed taken by the Klansmen. The Klansmen take him to a rural barn, and they beat him repeatedly. They beat him so badly, in fact, that when his body is discovered, he has to be identified by his dental records because his face is unrecognizable. His mother is brave enough. She demands an open casket at his funeral because she says, I want the world to see what these monsters did to my son. Brave woman. And unfortunately, despite her bravery, no one was ever convicted for Emmett Till's murder. He did not get justice. By 1957, the Little Rock Nine are integrating Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, the governor of Arkansas has ordered the National Guard, under his orders, to prevent these black students from attending what was an all-white school at one point. President Eisenhower sends his own order and has the National Guard escort these kids to school. This is another good example of, if I was to go back to the election map, and Eisenhower's opponent, Adlai Stevenson, in 1952, won only deep southern states. Eisenhower swept the rest of the country and won resoundingly, winning only a few states in the South at all. And all of the former Cotton states went Democratic because the Democratic Party was very, very vehemently opposed to the civil rights movement. And the Republican Party, in particular, Dwight Eisenhower, was very much in support of it. And this 1957 decision for Eisenhower to order the National Guard to escort these students to school is a major step, again, in the civil rights movement. In 1959, the Greensboro Four begin to protest at sit-ins at the Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. After 6 months, the Woolworth finally desegregated its lunch counter. They were successful. So again, it is the 1950s that really sees the biggest growth in the civil rights movement, and that stems from honorable service in World War II. And with each success came even more support for the movement. You can see with labeled pictures, I'll start in the top left and work my way clockwise. In 1947, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. In 1948 was Harry Truman's executive order. In 1954, segregation in public schools, and all public facilities for that matter, are found to be unconstitutional. In 1957, you have this very famous photograph of one of the students who is going to attend Central High School and the kind of hatred that they were forced to deal with. And in 1955, I'm sorry, I said I would go clockwise, and I did it as though I was reading a book. In 1955, you have both Rosa Parks and the horrendous story of Emmett Till. And you can see just how badly he was beaten and why his dental records had to be used to identify him. So you can see the Greensboro Four at this sit-in 1959, and this is a very powerful image. It's a powerful image because these men are demanding service at a restaurant that will not serve blacks, but they will allow a black to be an employee and serve others. So this is a powerful photo, not only because of the bravery of the Greensboro Four, but because of the symbolism of the black man who was able to work there and serve others, but wouldn't be allowed to sit at the lunch counter and himself enjoy a meal. You can see another sit-in by 1963 in Jackson, Mississippi. I know that this is a presentation about the 50s, but the reason I want to show this is because by 1963, after the success of the Greensboro Four in 1959, you're seeing white folks aiding in the sit-in movement for desegregation of private establishments as well as public facilities. So the movement is growing. The movement is gaining more support, and not just within the black community. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, better known as SNCC, is a group that not only organized sit-ins, but marched against violations of blacks' civil rights, in particular their right to vote. And they very much promoted the idea of whites and blacks working together to advance civil rights. President Eisenhower gained even more notoriety and popularity as he faced even more foreign policy issues later in the 50s. When he first took office, one of his foreign policy decisions that was quite popular was ending the Korean War and reaching an agreement to go back to the original 38th parallel borders between North and South Korea. And this is probably one of the first examples of a war that was not fought for total victory in the same way that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were defeated so wholeheartedly, so vehemently, and rather only to push back against and contain Chinese and Soviet power. Some other things that Eisenhower dealt with a little later in his presidency, in 1956, which just so happened to be a re-election year for President Eisenhower, General Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt asked the U.S. for help building a dam along the upper Nile River, and they wanted to irrigate desert land as well as provide electricity to the region. And the U.S. refused because of the Egyptians' anti-Israel views. So when we refused aid, the Egyptians immediately turned to the Soviet Union for aid. And after receiving that aid, the Egyptians chose to nationalize the Suez Canal that connected the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. The canal system had been built and owned by the British and the French, so naturally the British and French are angry that the Egyptians nationalize the canal. This is a term commonly used in communist nations when they nationalize something. The government now owns something, taken away from the private owners who originally owned it. And as the Suez Crisis continued, the British and French actually attack Egypt. They attack through the Sinai Peninsula via Israel and seize control of the canal. Now, Eisenhower is absolutely furious. He was not consulted on this, and he publicly criticized the attack. And between Eisenhower's pressure and pressure from the U.S. State Department, the attackers actually withdrew. A major showdown with the Soviets was avoided, but this nearly spiraled out of control. And it led Eisenhower to, after the fact, issue the Eisenhower Doctrine a year later, after he was reelected. He said that if any Middle Eastern nation was threatened by communism, that he would send U.S. troops. And only a year after that, in 1958, U.S. troops were sent to Lebanon to prevent a communist takeover there. The Domino Theory, as we have discussed in class with our assignment discussions, was presented to President Eisenhower by his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. And really, the fear here was that if one country fell to communism, surrounding nations might also fall to communism. This is a huge fear. John Foster Dulles does a great job of presenting this idea to President Eisenhower because it almost immediately becomes a part of U.S. foreign policy. Additional alliance systems beyond NATO were also formed to try to offset the power of communist nations like China and the Soviet Union. One of these organizations was the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, for short known as SEATO, and it was a pact between the United States, Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, Pakistan, Thailand, and the Philippines. This becomes one of the reasons the United States is drawn into the war in Vietnam, because of commitments to SEATO to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Along with the Domino Theory, one of the things that United States foreign policy did to deter communist aggression in the world is the threat of massive retaliation. And one reason that the U.S. and Soviet Union kind of had this unspoken agreement that neither would ever fire missiles is because of mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. So allow me to explain this. Secretary of State Dulles used very strong language quite frequently against the Soviets, and saying that any move against NATO would result in massive retaliation. He never used the specific words of nuclear weapons, but everybody, including the Soviet Union, knew exactly what he meant by this. And it's possible that the only reason that nuclear weapons were never deployed by either side is due to mutually assured destruction, which said that nuclear war would result in both nations, and probably the entire Earth for that matter, being absolutely destroyed. So it was really out of fear of what would come from a nuclear exchange that prevented things like, in the future, we will learn about the Cuban Missile Crisis under President Kennedy. We'll cover that in the next chapter when we cover the 60s. You can see a political cartoon here. And it is funny because both sides, nearly identical, having stockpiles. You can't tell which side's which, really. And you see the signs on the nuclear stockpiles that say, on no account to be used, because the enemy might retaliate. That's the concept of massive retaliation and mutually assured destruction. Now, what's done during the 50s to try to reassure people? Well, believe it or not, there were cartoons, one of which was Bert the Turtle, and it was called Duck and Cover, and this was shown to kids of how to duck and cover, such as getting under your desks at school, if a possible nuclear strike was going to happen. And that's kind of comical because if there's going to be a nuclear weapon dropped, hiding under your desk is probably not going to help you. But these things were produced and done specifically to provide a little comfort, particularly to children, that they would be okay. And knowing that if there ever was a nuclear exchange in their city, that they likely wouldn't be alive to worry about that they had been kind of fibbed to by cartoons like Bert the Turtle says duck and cover. You could see here a photograph of a bomb shelter that was built by this family, and a father and his son are hanging out in the bomb shelter. And you can see it's well supplied with food in case they have to live in this manner after a nuclear strike. So the fear is real. Now, Sputnik. Sputnik freaked the United States out horribly. Sputnik was put into space by the Soviets in 1957. It quite literally had no capabilities whatsoever other than staying in orbit. And this sparked the space race between the two nations. Both Eisenhower and after him Kennedy support it. Spending on science education increases in the United States. How could we dare let the communists put a satellite into space? They must be spying on us. Well, this actually had no capabilities, but it did strike fear into the hearts of Americans because they weren't sure what capabilities it did or didn't have, and we had not reached a point of being able to do similar things ourselves. It wasn't always only the Soviet Union that was viewed as the bad guy. There was a 1960 incident right before Eisenhower was about to leave office, and in the middle of the 1960 presidential campaign, that a U.S. spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. The pilot, his name was Gary Powers, was exchanged to the U.S. for one Soviet spy, so both sides kind of got something out of the exchange. But the bigger outcome here is that right before President Kennedy is about to take office and Eisenhower leaving office, and it's in the middle of the presidential campaign, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev cancels a summit conference with President Eisenhower. Tensions rise as a result, and he continues that rough relationship with President Kennedy as well. Now, what could we say about 1950s society? Well, there's authors like Allen Ginsberg, pictured here with musician Bob Dylan, and Jack Kerouac, who wrote a book called On the Road, and this is the Beats. Before there was the hippies, there were the Beats, and they were anti-conformist. They did not believe in the conformity of the 1950s that everybody else seemed to believe in. They were very much against that. It's not nearly as famous because it wasn't popular. It was not cool or hip or whatever to be a beat. By the 1960s and hippies, who had a lot of the same ideals, it was a little more popularized by then, which is why that term and that time period are much more famous. Now, as far as traditional society that we do know a lot about, rock music and names like Elvis Presley become household names. You also have the rise of Hollywood B movies like The Blob, and we'll talk about this in class. These things are almost all, in some way, shape, or form, centered around communism, the Red Scare, the fear of change, leading to communism spreading to the United States. So when rock and roll music is rejected by the older generations, as much as younger generations loved it, it is because they thought it would denigrate society to the point of us becoming communists. The fear of the blob was rooted out of the nuclear arms race and what could happen after a nuclear explosion. And that was rooted very much in the East versus West pro and anti-communist mentalities. And then with all these conformities, like, McCarthyism and the support for that, and how it was a blatant violation of some people's civil liberties, as well as the conformity of consumerism and such of the 50s. People like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg did not support that conformity. The end of the 1950s comes when President John F. Kennedy is elected over Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. And it was a very close election, very hotly contested, but this is the perfect segue between learning about the 50s and segueing into the 60s. That is the end of the Chapter 24 lecture on the 1950s. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you in class.